So hello, thank you, Obehi. I'm Talawa Adodo. I'm currently a visiting professor at the moment in African American Studies at the University of Houston.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi A14, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started with this episode.
I got my doctorate in Africology at the University of Temple. All right, not the University of Temple, I mean Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's in the United States. So that's in terms of my academic background. In terms of my personal background, I'm Jamaican, but I was born in Toronto, Canada. So pretty much a large Jamaican and Caribbean population in general there amongst the African people there. And that's about it. That's about it. We'll probably get more into my personal story as we talk about, some of the work I do, because it's very much connected to, my upbringing and other things about my life.
Absolutely, that is beautiful. In fact, we are going to spend because you have a lot of richness around you now, coming from Jamaica, the land of Marcus Garvey, Bob Marley. There is a lot of things to know about that. But let's spend some time with you. Tell us about your where you grew up. Let us see how you begin to form your identity around yourself.
So I grew up in Toronto, which is the capital city of Ontario, which is a province in Canada. So Canada is just north of the United States, for those who may not know, a former British settler colony. So there's that. In terms of my upbringing, so I grew up in Toronto, sort of the surrounding areas of Toronto. I have, I have a Jamaican family. We're Jamaican. I grew up in Toronto's a very multicultural environment. So what I think is important, at least I can say from my upbringing, you really realize, because it can go a lot of different ways, but for me, it was very obvious who I was in terms of identity, because the thing is, in Toronto, most African people you talk to in Toronto, there's actually a Jamaican colleague of mine, a friend of mine, he's born in Jamaica, and he always makes the joke, he goes, you'll find no Black people in Toronto. Because if you ask, at least people my age, so people basically 25 and older and other generations, if you ask them what they are, they're usually not going to say Canadian. You understand what I mean? So they'll say Jamaican. So I think that was extremely important in terms of the research I started to undertake, or what I would later undertake as I got older. I think it was very important for me to not understand or not see myself as a Canadian, right? Because people of my generation, because I think it changes, because I'm a first generation born in Canada, or plantationed in Canada. I use the term plantation for when you have African people being, really because of manipulated immigration, being forced to grow up in, white dominant countries like Canada, Australia, etc. So I think what's important is that I understood what Canadian meant and what Jamaican meant. I think that has a lot to do with a lot of things in terms of why I didn't have so much identity confusion. But more importantly, I think learning about, because you mentioned Marcus Garvey earlier, I think learning about people like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, a lot of Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist thinkers at an early age made me very clear, at least, that I am, an African person. So when I say Jamaican, I don't say Jamaican in a ethno-nationalist kind of way. I understand, Jamaican as a type of African person. You understand what I mean? So I think that's very important. Now, I know, not all Jamaicans think that way. Thank you to the welfare Queen of England's miseducation system, in Jamaica and other parts of, British colonized parts of the world, right? That colonial confusion. But I think that was very important at a young age, understanding that, I am an African person. Because there were a lot of people around me who were very historically aware. and that rubbed off on me. And, here we are today. The rest is history.
And that is a lot in there, but we're going to be peeling it out like an onion, one piece at a time. Actually, one layer at a time. All right. You did make mention of the word identity confusion, and I find it very interesting because identity crisis, identity confusion, okay, we are there almost in the same place. Because if you look at the larger African demography, the larger African diaspora as it were, that is a term that we don't use quite often, but that is actually the best way to describe where we are today as a people. Of course, not only even only the African diaspora, even right in Africa, this is a disease that we are suffering from. So, because you made mention of fear, that is why I'm referring to this. What does it mean? People talking of identity confusion, what does it mean? Because now, in your early age, anyway, of course, later I will still ask you, how come you didn't suffer from this identity confusion? So help me understand, what does it even mean?
You know what? So the two questions is, how did I not suffer from identity confusion? And what do I mean? I'll start with the what do I mean part by identity confusion. When you're talking about African people, how I understand identity confusion is when we want to identify with everything but each other. So, in the United States, for example, you have this movement, the FBA, the Foundational Black American Movement, or the American Descendants of Slaves, all these type of Afrophobic identity formations. And then in the Caribbean, you see a strong resistance, indoctrinated resistance to, being African, even having, locks like myself. You see, I have free-form locks, the way people in the Caribbean, and you probably know in some parts of the continent how men in locks are responded to, right? The reception of that, right? All these types of things are part of us, the colonial indoctrination, the Eurasianization of our minds, right? Where we're resistant to anything African. So what I mean by identity confusion is when we want to distance ourselves as much as possible from being who we are as Black people or as African people. We just want to be very distant from that. So that's the first part of your question. Does that part make sense?
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or what I will give, because so on the diaspora perspective, we don't want to associate with being African. So we'll say I'm Black American or I'm Jamaican. And I explain, I understand Jamaican as a type of African. Not a lot of Jamaican people would not agree with that. There's some who would agree, who would understand, who have the common sense to understand it, and others, unfortunately, who do not. So there's that part. But on the flip side, what I observe with African people on the continent is one, not seeing people in the diaspora as African. That's the one thing. And the second thing is also maybe more of, I don't like the word tribe, but maybe more of an ethnic nationalism, like saying, oh, well, I'm Nigerian, you're Ghanaian, we don't have anything in common. Africa's not a monolith, so we can't just do one African culture type thing, that kind of mentality. So anything that really deviates from a Pan-Africanist thinking that, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X talk about, anything that deviates from that is identity confusion.
Thank you so much for that. That is very important. In fact, that is a foundation for a lot of argument that we can actually take, looking into Pan-Africanism and all that. Anyway, let's come to you. You are a university professor. Tell me a little bit, what is your area of concentration? Expand on that, please.
Well, what I focus on, because I have a few areas of interest, but my favorite, I guess the heart, my passion is languages. So, but more specifically, what I look at is the relationship between African languages on the continent and languages of African people in the diaspora. So, for example, in my dissertation, that I finished my dissertation this past summer, my dissertation translation as a cultural act, I look at Medu Neter, that is the language of the people of Kemet, which unfortunately we know primarily in Eurocentric terms as ancient Egypt. So I look at the Kemetic language from a Jamaican perspective. So basically in that dissertation is the first dissertation to take a text from an African language and translate it into a Caribbean language. You see what I mean? And Now, the part about my dissertation that's important, even though I'm looking at, the language of Kemet and I'm, doing Jamaican translations of certain things, I'm situating both languages within a larger African context in that dissertation. So basically, my research does is to show, building off what I do in my dissertation, my research shows that the way African people in the diaspora talk is an African language, not a retention, not an African influence, an African language. And I primarily base my argument on the basis of grammar, right? Because the grammar you see in the Jamaican language, for example, is tied to African grammar, like the way we use verbs, for example. What African languages have is not a focus on tense, like we see with Indo-European languages, like your Italian, your French, your Spanish, English, blah, blah, blah. But in African languages, rather, the verbs, the way we use verbs is about aspect. So it's how an action occurs. Like let me say, I'll give you an example. If I say, me attack, right? Me attack. You would say that in Ebonics here in the United States, I'm talking, right? Or let me do a more clear example. We attack, no, right? In Ebonics here in the United States, you would say we're talking, we talking, right? But in English, because you see I was slipping up there, in English, you would have to say we are talking, or if you're referring it to a past, we were talking. But because African languages are based on aspect, the nature of an action, we just say we are talk or we talking. And that basically is explaining what was happening in the moment. And I call that momentary aspect. That's my term. I hope that makes sense, because I know I threw a lot of
Of course,
jargon there.
it makes sense. We're going to take advantage of your presence here to expand on most of this issue. It makes sense, and it's also very intriguing the way you are looking at it, no? Because the reason we are calling upon you is because you're an expert in this area, so we are going to be squeezing out every moment that we have here. Now, first, help me understand it. What interests you in the studying of languages?
Personally, well, when I was a child, I talked about the plantation environment I grew up in Toronto. So one of the things in Canada, their second official language is French. So in grade school, I learned French from first grade. So that is from about 6 years old to the ninth grade. So about 13, 14 years old. So from grade 1 to 9, I learned French. Now, in school, I had a lot of struggles, especially in elementary school. Yeah, kind of toward the end of high school, it got a little better, but I had a lot of, issues with school, given, the racist context of school. And I was a very politicized child, so keep that in mind. But one of the things that I was good at was French, right? I was generally good with language. So French was the first language, unfortunately, that I was good at, but it's what it is. So I think because I had that early success learning other languages, it gave me a certain confidence. So then I went on to learn, I learned ancient Greek. I remember because I wanted to read, how Greek thinkers talked about Africa. And then when I did my master's in Egyptology at the University of Toronto. The program is ancient Near East studies, but my focus was, Egyptology and Nubian studies. And I was able to, learn the Medu Neter, that is the language of Kemet, which I mentioned earlier. So I've always had a passion for learning language very young. So I think it just started, like I said, I was strong in language very early, learning other languages. So I wanted to just keep learning. And now I'm at the stage where I need to learn more about African languages in my research, to really decolonize the way that we think. I realize language is fundamental to the decolonization of the African mind.
All right. So you learn a language and you're able to read in this language, no? For example, like French and Asian Kemet languages. Where would one start? Say maybe, for example, an adult, a young adult, wanting to learn. Because also another important thing that you said there refers to the fact that you want to know how the Greek think, no? Of course, someone could say, why don't you take a book that has been written by Greek, but of course you are going to read it in English because it has been translated to English. It's still within thinking. But instead, you want to read it in their old text, in their old language. Is there any difference there? Help us understand it.
Woo! There is a difference. So part of it with the Greek thing, There was a text where there's a Greek historian, Herodotus, who, because I used to get involved, as you know, there's a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of debate, or not debate, really just dishonesty from the Eurocentric Academy about the fact that the people of Kemet are Black people, hence the term Kemet itself means nation of Black people. You can see the foolishness of that, but you can see what my interest in Greek writers was, that they are very clear that the people of Kemet are Black people, because there's this idea that people never thought of themselves as Black until the 15th century. No one used racial terms before that, and all the other kinds of really foolishness. So I had the Greek historical record I could read, like ancient Greek, and I could show, no, they're talking about, Black people as Black people, you know, and there's some racial dynamics that come with that. And that was more so because Greek and Roman literature was a bit more accessible to me in terms of the academic spaces I was in. But when I was able to actually learn Medu myself, I realized, I said, what am I doing? I don't even know the actual language of the people I'm, the African people I'm interested in. I need to find some way to access that. And then when I did my master's, I was able to do that, albeit I learned it from a Eurocentric perspective, but I was at least exposed to it. So I had some kind of functional understanding. And then when I got to Temple University, I always call them the big three. I'm at the big three: Kimani Nehusi, Dr. Kimani Nehusi, Dr. Amma Mazama, and Dr. Mlefekete Asante. When I met the three of them, and learning under them, really changed my life for the better in terms of re-Africanizing and de-whitenizing my mind. Because with Dr. Asante talking about Ebonics in the United States as an African language, Dr. Amma Mazama talking about her language in Guadeloupe as an African language, and then Dr. Nahusi talking about languages in general of the Caribbean as African languages, that had a profound influence on me, because it made me realize, like, wow, I've been speaking an African language the whole time and not even realizing it, right? Because if you asked me this before my research, before coming to Temple, if I speak an African language, I would kind of say, well, there's probably some connection between, Jamaican and other African languages. I could see it. Like, for example, the Igbo people in Nigeria, they say uno. It's the same word we use in Jamaican. It means y'all, for those who might not know what that means. So I would notice things like that. But when I got a systematic understanding, like, it wasn't that I was talking a language that has some influence from Africa with some English words. I realized, no, man, yeah, speak a pure African language, right? I started to realize it changed the whole way I think about language. So that's really was the turning point, because even what my dissertation was going to be about, I can barely remember what I was going to do. I switched it to, what I was telling you about earlier with my work in translation. So now I can really say that when you look at the language of Kemet now, or the Medu Neter, you can call it either or. When you're looking at it from the perspective of an African language speaker, you get more out of it, because they think and talk like us. And that's how you realize these are really African people you're talking about. This is a real African people you're dealing with here. So you can tell. So I'll give an example. If I was to do, let's say, an ancient Greek text in the Jamaican language, I would have a lot of translation problems, because the ancient Greek language is a European language. So there's certain grammatical constructions, critical grammatical constructions, that you can do in Greek that you can't do in Jamaican. However, if I do Jamaican translations of Kemetic texts, that there's no such issue. There's like little word concept things. There's very slight things, but no major structural differences. Like, remember what I said earlier about, aspect in the way African people, we use verbs. It's the same thing in Medu Neter. It's the same thing. So it's things like that. You're really seeing that you're talking about African people. And how do you know that they're an African people you're talking about? Well, talk about the language from an African perspective. You got to deal with our languages, and you see it really borne out when you're able to do that.
That's interesting.
No,
That's very
it's
interesting.
fun. It was no, it was it's crazy. It's crazy, but we need to do, and I'm doing more work, getting more work out there where I'm showing the way we speak in the diaspora is an African language, and I'm using Medu Neter to kind of reinforce that.
All right. Now, uh, this language that you read about in Africa, uh, is it only the one that you have read from European writers of Africa, or have you also have the chance to read, to see maybe the resource in Africa in terms of comparison?
Absolutely. I definitely consult what we are saying about our own languages. That's part of what, like for example, there's a scholar who I'm a friend, a colleague of mine at the University of Ghana, Legon, in the Institute of African Studies, Obadele Kambon, and he does amazing work on African languages, and putting them in a Pan-African context. And and he and I have discussions all the time. That's just one example. There's also one of my major influences, Theophilo Benga. You've probably heard about Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga maybe a couple times, maybe. But Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga were two continental African scholars who, demonstrated on a systematic level the connection between Kemet and other African cultures on the continent, primarily in West and West Central Africa. So I read, before I started taking Egyptology, I was already reading Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga. So I was really, but I said one of the problems, one of my limitations that I had was just not knowing a continental African language. But once I realized the relationship between the Jamaican language and other African languages, when I'm reading African writers talking about their languages, I start to see connections right away. So for example, I'm currently reading an essay, a few essays about certain grammatical features of the Akan language among the Akan people of Ghana, specifically Tree. And I see a lot of connections between Tree and Jamaican for a lot of obvious historical reasons, because there was a large, Akan and Igbo population in Jamaica and Kikongo as well. So the Akan commonalities or continuities in Jamaica are very well documented. So I'm able to read African scholars as well. So in fact, I read African scholars more than I read European ones when talking about African languages. The only language that I think does have the bias of a lot of European scholarship is the Medu Neter, because of, the colonial discipline of Egyptology. But if you want to learn about Yoruba, Akan, etc., there's a lot of African people writing on that. So I don't run into that issue. So I think that's interesting what you're telling me about some scholars having that issue. I haven't had that issue.
Thank you so much. That is very important. Now, we are talking of language. What is even language? How do you describe language?
Language. If I had to give a catch-all term, man, you're putting me on the spot, man. But if I had to put it in one term, I would say it's essentially language is a vehicle of cultural expression, right? Of a people's cultural expression. One of many, but a very critical one, because it's basic cultural expression that has a particular set of grammatical rules, right? Because you have to communicate. So I think and the reason why I say that it's important to understand language as a cultural expression, because this goes to what you asked me before. A lot of times when we're discussing our languages, even if you have an African scholar, discussing African languages, it's hard for us to escape a Eurocentric perspective, because obviously a lot of us are Eurocentrically trained. Even myself, it's a kind of a tug of war, right? Because a lot of times we're writing about our languages from a non-African language perspective. So we'll be writing about Igbo from an English perspective, or Yoruba from a German perspective, or House Swahili from a French perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why, for me, it's critical that we get into the habit of making the connection between languages in the diaspora and languages in the continent, because it bridges that gap between the diaspora and the continent. So I think what we need is literature that, translation literature done in the languages of Black people. So I think it's important, for example, to see Yoruba proverbs in the Haitian language, for example. You see what I mean? I think that's something that's really critical.
All right, the next one, the next layer that we are peeling just now is even what is the relevance of language to the culture? Because of course this is leading us to somewhere, no? I'm trying to understand how important it is our languages to our culture.
Well, I mean, language, because first, even the people, right? So I mentioned Igbo, Yoruba, Akan, Jamaican. How do you know what's one of the immediate ways you can tell what a person is? You go to their language. That's why, the expression goes, you speak to a man, you can speak to his mind, but if you speak to his language, you speak to his heart. I probably ruined that a bit, but the part about if you speak a man's language, you speak to his heart. It's part of who we are, because I think one of the problems in how we understand culture sometimes, or part of the Eurocentric distortion, is that we try to separate culture from people, and that's just not a good thing to do, right? Because language contains things about our cultural perspective, our social and historical conditions are communicated in language, our values are communicated in language, among a number of things. That's why it's important to understand language as a form of cultural expression, a
All right.
vital form of cultural expression or communication even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, according to you now, and also it's one way to think a bit, you should be able to get what you're saying. That language is actually central to our communication, to our culture. Let's call it like that. Have you heard of the? It's not the idea, the reality. It happened to me a couple of days ago. I interviewed a linguist who is also a university lecturer in the U.S. It happened to him too because he was born during the colonial era. No, what I want to make mention of is the fact that you going to school in your country for speaking your language, you will be punished. I don't know if this only happened in that because he's coming from Benin Republic, no, which is just a neighbor of Nigeria. And in
Right.
Nigeria, it happened to Rod, it happened to me. It's still happening today that you are punished for speaking your language. And that might seem very simple now. Okay, you are punished, but there is a message there that anytime you hear this your language, consider it negative because remember the punishment are punished because in our place, in my language, it said that Eboka luaho or agboiba. So when a child does something wrong, you punish the child. It's not necessarily because of that thing that he has done. So that it doesn't repeat it next time. That is what you are doing. So when you now punish children for speaking your language, you are installing a message in their head. And if language is important for us, if it is a vehicle for our culture, does that have any consequence? It's your opinion, please.
Oh, it has huge consequences. It's funny that story you told me. This is a story. Here goes as a father. I've my father, who was born in Jamaica, had the same experience. So I don't use the term patois, but most Jamaicans would use the term patois, right? Patois is bad talking, right? You would be disciplined for speaking that language, and that just tells you the nature of the environment you're in, where your own culture or a critical aspect of your culture is looked down upon. You can tell what you're dealing with is a colonial or a plantation condition, because even speakers of the language are told that what they do is inferior. So that just shows you this goes back to what we talked about at the top, the identity confusion, or maybe I might, instead of saying identity confusion, cultural disorientation or cultural confusion that it causes. And I know my advisor, my mentor, Amma Mazama, she says one of the critical aspects that colonization does, when you're told to speak, the colonizer's language, is that through education, media, etc., is that there's colonial alienation, or what we as Afrocentrists call dislocation. Right, because I remember there's a scholar, an Igbo scholar, I think it's or novelist, Chimamanda Adichie. I think I'm saying her name right. You're
Yeah,
familiar with
Chimamanda
her?
Adichie, yeah.
Yeah, Chimamanda Adichie. And one of the things she said is, and she wasn't saying it to be, the context in which she said is important when she said, there are certain intellectual concepts she cannot express in Igbo, she can only express in English. And she wasn't saying that, and I want to context, it's not that she was saying that Igbo doesn't have, intellectual substance. It's just that they don't make it a priority to teach African languages in schools. And that's what happens, right? So when you start to see some of the language issues, some of the language barriers that happens to children in schools, right? Because they say the children that learn the best are those, in terms of speaking English or even speaking French, those that learn it the best learn it when taught in their own language, right? So you understand English better when you're taught it in Igbo. But what we do in African countries, and I include the Caribbean, as African countries in the Caribbean, what happens is you're taught European languages as if you're European. You understand what I mean? So could you imagine the amount of learning difficulties that come with that? And I can tell you, even as a Jamaican, though raised in diaspora, I can talk about a lot of the confusion, a lot of the struggles I had with English, even though, I have family members who are strong English speakers, though some family members are not as strong English speakers as others, but just culturally, because sometimes we think of language as just a technical thing, but when you understand it culturally, I start to look back on certain experiences I had in school. I realized, wow, there were certain aspects of English I really didn't understand, right? Because we don't think of English as a cultural thing. We're taught, given the system of Eurasianization as education, we're taught to think, oh, English is just normal, French is just normal, right? But when you think of them as cultural languages, as English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, French, the language of the French Anglo-Saxons, or whatever, so on and so on, you start to realize how cultural language is. It's not a neutral terrain. That's why it's not surprising the same issues that they're having right now in Ghana. I think in Ghana, both Ghana and Jamaica, there's been this push for compulsory French, but in schools, but not as much a push for the actual languages of the people in the school system, especially in Jamaica. Colleagues I know are deeply invested in trying to get the Jamaican language as official instead of English, or alongside English. You can't even go tell them to dash away English. You have to say put Jamaican alongside, because of how deep the indoctrination is. Because when you think of Jamaica, you don't think of the welfare queen's English. What do you think of? You tell me Marcus Garvey and Bob Marley, how much English they speak, right? Think about it. And that's how twisted the situation we are in right now. But of course, there's ways for us to, remedy that. But, it's just a lot of work. We got our work cut out for us.
Because in the beginning, when I was asking you about yourself, you forming your identity, you did make mention of something very important, which was the fault, which was the fact that you didn't suffer this identity confusion, this identity crisis. I want to call it sometime. And for somebody who is looking at it from a distance, I don't understand how it is created. Actually, it is created because looking at a child now that is going to school, being punished for speaking his or her language, and we pretend that doesn't have any consequence. Now you go to school, all the reality that goes into your head comes through a language, which is actually a window. That doesn't have any consequence. You have a lot of, please.
It does. Like there's two ways. So in the continent, you have people, or in the Caribbean, you have people, you see, it teaches, Africa, it teaches us to devalue ourselves, right? That's the first thing. It's teaching, you're devaluing yourself. You devalue your language, you devalue your culture, and by default, you devalue yourself. You accept that inferiorization. So that has so many consequences in and of itself. But just to give an example of my childhood, because I went to one of the school environments I went to was very, multicultural, and I don't advise, African parents to really, if they are, schooling their children, to not do the multicultural thing. I strongly advise against it. I'll add that. If you can avoid it, avoid it. I'll say that. And part of it is, remember what I said about Toronto being multicultural. You realize very quickly who you are when you're interacting with other people outside of your culture. You can't. So that doesn't happen for everybody, but in my case, it definitely did. Like you have kids who are Italian, kids who are Portuguese, kids who are Jamaican, kids who are from Trinidad, kids who are Nigerian, et cetera, et cetera. And part of one of the ways that you can make that you have that understanding is when people think of Jamaica right away, they think of language. Right. So to me, it's a marker of what you are. And I think because, I can't speak the language, because I think for some, Jamaicans in Toronto, some children, especially those of the current generation, I guess Gen Z, I think is the term, might not feel that way depending on how their household environment was. They might not feel Jamaican. They might fall into the area of seeing themselves as a chocolate covered Canadian. Because I'm very clear, you have to understand Canadian as a white identity, because the people of Canada are nothing but, a group of Europeans who invaded another people's land and nearly genocided them and, occupy it now. So I think that's very important. I think that too, I didn't have this romantic view of Canada, because I know a lot of people have criticism for the United States, but Canada has this false reputation as this goody two shoes country, which is far from the truth. So I think those two factors play a role. So in terms of how I didn't fall into that confusion, I think if I couldn't speak the language, it wasn't around my environment. People externally can tell you that you're Jamaican, because sometimes I mispronounce certain things in school. Like one of the things I was tormented for was because I say axe, or because I say bathroom, or I don't, the word human, I can't say the H sound. Human, I just say human. I've been saying that for years, right? It wasn't until I got older, right? Certain people would pick on you, but that's because in Jamaican, the way H is used is, you wouldn't have H in human, put it that way, right? H's are a bit ambiguous in the Jamaican language. So there's a lot of cues that make it very clear, right, that you're not. Because like I said, the colonizers have a way, when you're in direct contact with them, reminding you that you're not part of their group, which for me was healthy. I think it was healthy to be clear. I like clarity of terms.
And if we are sincere with ourselves, we should be able to understand that the best we can ever be imitating other is inferior. The best
Right.
inferior. That is the best we can be. Whereas it is
I
better.
like that concept, but I don't like it. But it's the best. I like that. I'm gonna maybe teeth that one from you now. All right, I like that one. I like that one.
All right. In that we're going to look for a way to retrace our own step and be even the worst about ourselves, and then begin to work on ourselves and be the best copy of other people. Because it is very easy to write you off if you are just pretending to be who you are not, because you don't really have a root. But if you are yourself now, even though you have error, you have mistake, because who doesn't have mistake? If we take up a European culture, we say that there are a lot of mistakes also that they make. That is human. That is why it is organic. It's not a four square perfect angle. It is organic. It's formed. It transformed. Language is a living thing. Is that it continues to modify itself. It grows also. So we must accept ourselves the way we are and be ready to modify and be ready to change, adapt to change. Change. There is nothing you can do about it. It happens. So you were saying something about the multicultural thing, and this is very important for our demography, African diaspora. I would like you to say something more about that. Do you see any danger?
Okay, so the danger of multiculturalism is to me very simple. It's a nice way. I don't even think if it's a nice way. It's sugarcoating the way that the colonizer keeps us confused. So instead of saying, for example, Obehi, I don't want you to practice your culture. I want you to be like me. They take a nicer approach. Oh, Obehi, I like your food, that Esan food you make. I like the language you talk, right? To kind of seduce you, in being interested in them, so that they can, one, fetishize your culture as an object to be played with, and also they can dilute what your culture is. So I'll give an example, right, of this in a Toronto context, because this is something that's part of our confusion, that oftentimes as African people, we don't realize when other groups of people are fetishizing us. So let's say, like, there was a mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford, the crack mayor, Rob Ford, um, of Toronto. And a lot of African people would think he was a good mayor because he attempted to speak Jamaican. And they get all excited. I like Rob Ford, I like him. All this kiki about Rob Ford. Meanwhile, he mocks Black people. He does explicitly, anti-Black policies, as to be expected from Canada. But we'll praise him and hype him up and all this foolishness, right? So you think that that's good. You don't recognize the fetishism part, that he's really making a joke of you. So there's the other part, that fetishism mockery part. But then there's the second thing, and you mentioned about protectionism. One of the stupid things that happens with African people, that happens, I'm just giving Toronto as an example, because I'm sure this is all over, I'm sure, but I'm just, again, speaking it in some of my experiences with in Toronto. There's the Caravana Festival. I know it goes by a different name now, but it's one of the probably the most famous Caribbean festival, arguably, right? One of the things that they will do is have non-African people, because if you ever go to a Caribbean festival, there's floats, there's people play a mass, right? A masquerades and all that. You will see non-African people on the floats. Now, it's one thing if you have non-African people in attendance because you're in Toronto, right? The African population of Toronto. And when I say African, I mean Black, just in case it wasn't obvious, just to be clear. So the African Black population of Toronto is about 8% of Toronto's population. So I understand if you see non-African people, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when you have non-African people on the floats and dressing up in the costumes, that's de-Africanizing. It takes away from the meaning of carnivals, which is really the carnival tradition, at least in the Caribbean context, was us celebrating, one, being African, and two, celebrating being emancipated from enslavement, right? So why would you have, especially members of the race, of the group of people who were doing the enslavement, on the float? Because this is what happens when we detach culture from people, and it takes away the sacredness of what carnivals are supposed to be about. It becomes this money-making party, right? Rather than something, sacred, which it's supposed to be. It becomes this commercialization thing.
If we cannot allow people to join us in that sense, are we right to maybe accuse them of not allowing them us, or not allowing us also to join us, maybe when they are doing things that are predominantly their culture? I'm trying to see where we draw the line there, that this is what we have to do, this we cannot do.
I think it depends on the sacredness of what it is you're talking about. So for example, like I was talking about with Carnival, like I know, like I said, when you're in Toronto, right, 8% of the population is African. You're going to see many different groups of people in attendance at the carnival. It's a big carnival, right? Caravana's big event. That's unavoidable. That's not really a concern for me so much. But in terms of the people playing masquerades, because again, we get that from Africa, right? In the Caribbean, right? The masquerade. So you see what I did there, right? When you're talking about people on the floats, on the centerpieces of the festival, there should not be any person who's not African, of African background on there, because that's not that's not who it's for. It's silly. It's really silly. And I think because there are sometimes our people want to be involved in certain European things that we have no business in either. But the reason why we seek to be in those things is one of two things. One, the cultural confusion I talked about earlier, or two, certain monetary things. So for example, if you're involved in dance or theater, right? A lot of, if you want to get access to certain grants and certain funding, right? There are certain dance categories, certain theater categories, right? So sometimes we have to pretend like, okay, we got to do ballet. I want to do ballet because, it's ideal. But the only reason why it's considered ideal is because there are certain economic supports for ballet in that environment. So there's an economic aspect to it. You see? So that's what usually happens with our people. We're usually caught up in the economics of the industry, or it's cultural confusion, or sometimes just both those factors, but it's primarily that, right? You could even look at the Oscars, for example, the big Academy Awards amongst the European Film Academy in the United States, right? The reason why there's such a big deal about whether African people, Black people are in the Oscars is because it's expected that once you get an Oscar, you should be getting a certain level of promotion within the industry, right? Of acting, that type of thing, right? But then again, it goes back to, well, who controls that industry, right? So that gets into us, that question, this gets into the Garvey. This is where Garvey comes out, the importance of having our own institutions, right? So I think that's a question. So when you're talking about having your own institutions, it necessitates protectionism. So so in terms of drawing that line back more to your question, it depends on how sacred is this thing you're talking about. And that will differ from person to person, mind you.
And also
I'm giving my opinion.
Yeah, and also from group to group too. Depends. Yeah.
Right. Right. It depends. Like I said, I told you, I said, I know some people, it can rub people the wrong way. So I appreciate you allowing me to kind of give further context. Cause like I said, it really depends on the politics, right? Like I said, I'm very much, influenced by Marcus Garvey. So I understand the importance of us having, our own institutions. And I'll give it a comparative example. Remember what I said about Caravana? I remember one time when I was working, and I was working at a water park. I don't know, it was like a water theme park where I was working, and that water park was hosting India Day because there's a large, Indian community in the area of Toronto that I'm in, right? Or that I was in, because I'm not living there anymore. But what was interesting, when I went to the Indian events, they don't have that problem of non-Indians participating, right? Like you would see at Caravana in terms of in the centerpiece of the festival or the event. Like, for example, my issue with Caravana is you'll have some photographers, the women they're taking pictures of aren't African women. So you're going for Caravana, but yet as a photographer, you're taking pictures of women who aren't even African. Caravana is about Caribbean people. That doesn't make no sense, right? So we have to start asking those kind of questions, right? And that's where I think what the multiculturalism does, it starts to make us, we're not clear, because your point, remember what you asked me about, where do you draw the line? I think when we don't have a clear sense of what is sacred to us, and in terms of each thing that we do, the degrees of sacredness, that's what makes it hard to draw that line. But I think when we're clear on how sacred something is or should be, we're very clear on where those lines should be. Like I was able to very clearly demarcate to you how I want to do it, to, sort it out, how I want to cut it up, right? I'm like, nope, no here, no there. I'm very good when it comes to boundaries. And because I understand, understand terms, right? And I understand being African as being sacred. As an African person.
That's very important. That's very important. We must be able to know what is sacred and what is open, because I want to believe that even among the European, among the white people, they want to call themselves, I don't really know if we can say people are white or black as it were, but it's okay for the purpose of simplicity. Among the white people, there are some sacred events that other people are not invited to. Yes, if we look very well, we will see that there are, of course, there are open events, there are open cultures, no? But there are sacred cultures. Yeah. So it is not left for us to be able to know what we want and be able to negotiate and say, okay, yes, this, you are all welcome. This, you are welcome to this point. But after this point, you cannot go there. All right, now, talking of language, because this is very important for us now, I'm talking of also multiculturality, if we want to put it like that. Where do you see the role of parents in making sure that their children have a good grasp of their language? I'm not saying this is the only language that we are going to use to teach them now, because, okay, they live in a society, they must be able to express themselves and communicate in the society that they live in. If they are born in France, okay, they should be able to speak French. They shouldn't only speak the language of their parents now. But it's going to be a huge error if they don't understand the language of their parents now. So where do you see the role of the parents in making sure that their children understand their language and also the language of the society where they live?
Okay, so I guess when you ask that question, are you thinking of African people who are living in European countries? When you
Yeah.
ask,
African people
okay,
in
in
the
that
diaspora, yeah.
situation,
Yeah.
okay, because that's where I was going to tailor my answer to, because I think that that involves certain specifics. Okay, thank you for the clarification. For me, I think the role of parents, I don't think it's just parents, you know. I think you have to think about the larger community as well of African people. But in terms of specific things as parents, when we're choosing to live in, we have to be very, I have a child on the way. So, these are things that are discussed in our household. Funny, we were just talking about yesterday with my wife. But you have to look at what environments are you choosing to live in, and are these environments, are cultural spaces, culturally appropriate spaces, immediately accessible? You have to think about that, because sometimes our people were not thinking about that, right? You have to be very attentive to that. You don't want to be somewhere where you're like the only, sometimes some of our people like to be flies in buttermilk, or a fly in buttermilk. You can't do them things, right? You have to be very cognizant of that. I think sometimes we fall for that. So there's the social environment. Two, I think being part of social clubs and organizations catering to different groups of African people. So, for example, I like to be, one of the things that I think I benefited from being in Toronto is that there's different groups of African people. There's Nigerians, different groups of Nigerians, different groups of Ghanaians, etc. Right? And then different groups of Caribbean people, right? So I'm able to connect with different types of people and develop relationships with different people, because I think too often we want to have relationships with the society. When we really mean the society, we mean Europeans, more than we want to learn about ourselves. And I think that's one of the things parents have to be very intentional about exposing their child to other African cultures, right? Especially when you're in those environments, like if you're in European countries like that, you're gonna see, different groups outside of your own ethnicity. So you have to be really willing to engage in that. And the third thing I would say is being involved in organizations that have a very clear, have your political interests at heart, that are really about, interest groups, basically being involved in the interest groups, not just only the socializing when you want to go party, but also in organizations that are very serious about group cohesion. Like, for example, I'm signed up for the Nigerian organization here and where I'm at now. Like, I don't only just go to only Jamaican things, right? Because I'm a Pan-Africanist, right? So we parents have to think like Pan-Africanists, not ethno-nationalism, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. It makes sense. All right. You see, there is one argument that I had with a guy a couple of years ago, and it had to do with the way that we organize our society living outside. No, in that there is this sense of what they describe as ghettoization among African people. When they go outside, they organize themselves, they stay among themselves, and this again require an understanding of the fine line. Where do we define when is it too much? When is it enough? When is it just average? Done. If you look at it from a certain sense, it deprives the people of being able to integrate into the society and able to benefit from opening more your horizon, and instead of living in a small little ghetto, no. But if we look at it also from the other end, that is also what keep the culture alive. Because if you just come into the society and you just go inside it with the way the European are proposing their own integration, you are going to quickly get lost. Because you are an African, but an African that have been remade in Europe. When it comes to protecting our languages, what do you think we should do in terms of this society that we organize ourselves in the diaspora?
It's fundamental. You can't, because could you imagine if, because we talk about getting into to fitting into the society, like French society or English society or whatever. You think that you think, say, the English could have had England, everyone speaking English, if they had that lax mentality? oh, we have to integrate into everybody's society. Could you imagine the welfare queen saying that, oh, we have to integrate to everybody's society? I need to learn an African language. Because notice, they don't talk about having to learn your languages or the languages of different African immigrants. They're telling you to learn theirs. So again, you've accepted, you might not see it that way. I'm not saying you, I'm just saying you in a broad sense. You might not see it that way, but in reality, you're accepting that inferiorization, that subordinate position. That's how, multiculturalism is really, and, one of the very metaphorical ways that I describe multiculturalism as it pertains to African people is I really think we should look at multiculturalism as a European zoo of exotic things. And, I have this Jamaican exhibit I can go to, and this Nigerian exhibit I can go to, and this Congolese exhibit I can go to. We're more like things in a museum for them. That's what it's about. So that's how I see it from their perspective. That's how they see it. Right. But so that's another thing with this multiculturalism thing, because why? The reason we end up in these spaces is because of, European exploitation of African countries in Africa and the Caribbean right now. That's the defining reason, right? The main reason, if not the only, right? So I think that's important context to keep in mind. So when you talk about, the importance of speaking, as you have to speak your language, and you have to create institutions that reinforce the importance of your language. So when let's say, because a lot of this issue comes up with jobs, how are we going to get a job if we speak this way? Well, if you have your own institutions, be it social, economic, or political, you don't have to worry about that. But you have to be willing to build those things. You know what I mean? Right? You have to be willing to build and create those spaces. But sometimes we don't want to do the building part. We just want things right away. Right, we just want like that,
just to
right, that. But look at Indian and Chinese, right? And it's not because I think Indian and Chinese are smarter or anything than African people. It's just they haven't experienced enslavement and colonization the way we have. So when it comes to certain basic things about cohesion, we're dealing a lot with Eurasianization in terms of that more than they are, because of the enslavement experience. So we don't often think in terms of group preservation or racial preservation. We often don't like thinking in those terms, right? But other groups do it, right? And that, again, that's a result of conditioning. It's a very deep, there's a lot invested in keeping African people confused. There's a lot of investment added. That's systematic, right? So I think that's important, because think about it. If you go to open a school, for example, you want to open an African school, like an Afrocentric school or education space for children, and you say, look, we need people who speak African languages, this, and that African languages, right away, who's going to be able to be employed? Other African people. And who's going to be attending? You see how simple that is? When you just stick within your own culture, it's your immune system. It just spreads throughout. But a lot of times, because, and I'm a victim of this, right? We're all victims of this in varying degrees, but nonetheless, victims of this. We often know so much about other people than we do ourselves. We don't see oftentimes the power of being ourselves. And I know you had an expression for this, and I said I was going to teeth it from you about, we'd be a better inferior, I think you said.
That when we try to imitate other, we can become the best we can be is to be inferior.
Right. Yeah.
To be inferior up there.
Yeah. The best inferior, or something you said like that. We get like, because it's silly. Because the reason why I said it's a good concept, it's an unfortunate situation, but it captures, it's part of that problem when you fall into these arguments with people. Sometimes I try to avoid those arguments, as I get older and a bit wiser. And and seek like-minded people, as that can be challenging given the conditions, but I get it done. But I think that's sometimes what we get caught up in. We don't realize how much that affects the way we're responding. Because like I said, you're saying, oh, I don't know if I'll get a job doing this. Well, why don't you make a job that you can do that? Change the conditions. Sometimes we accept the terms rather than changing them for our own interests.
All right. Now, with your research, what do you do? Okay, I understand that you are teaching at the university. Expose your content to the people so that in a way that they can better understand. No, I'm not talking of your student now. I'm trying to understand if you have other way of outlet of your research and to get it to the people.
Other outlet, well, one, coming on platforms such as yours, where, we can have, casual, candid, but informative conversations. That's one way. That's something that I've been doing, I've been involved in, in terms of being, accessible. And that's primarily one thing I want to get into. I haven't been doing, I should do, but I think once I'm a bit more organized, is maybe even doing short writing pieces or short commentaries. As I was just being part of organizations and giving my input in that way with people who I'm organizing with. For example, you talked about, Garveyite organizations. I'm part of an organization, Afrocentricity International, where we have, several chapters throughout the world. In fact, recently we're just celebrating opening an African Renaissance temple in Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, right, where African people, can practice our own spiritual systems and a lot more than that, but be engaged in, practice our culture and grow from it, right? So we're so big up to AI, right? So we're able to do things like that. So there's that. So I think once we are thinking in an organizational capacity, how we organize around our culture, right? I think things become easier. I think that's really the key.
To conclude the conversation today, because we've talked about a lot of interesting things known about the languages and also how it relates to us in our culture and our expression and the way we interact with other people.
Final statement. African people, we need to learn our languages. They're fundamental to us re-Africanizing and de-whitenizing. And it's important that African people of the diaspora realize the way they talk is not bad talking, not inferior English or inferior French, but it is an African language, right? It's reflection of the African in us. We're not African influenced, we are African. I think that's very important.
Thank you so much. That is really powerful. I appreciate the time and also the contribution.
All right, I love being on here.
If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewanfo. Thank you so much for listening and talk to you in the next episode.